Noxious Markets, Deborah Satz. Satz's chapter and this excerpt that you've read on noxious markets comes from a larger work that Satz does on the nature of markets and what constitutes the proper goods for a market in general. So this is actually one chapter which sort of solidifies her position on how we evaluate whether or not a market is good or bad. Now, what Satz does is something different, and something I think we've hinted at the entire course. When we're looking at business ethics, oftentimes the real issue is not the practice in business. It's not whether or not businesses should, for example, be charging a certain amount for insuring people with pre-existing conditions. So if we're talking about the healthcare industry or the insurance industry, and we say, well, how much should they charge people who have a pre-existing condition? Now, that's one way of looking at the question, saying, well, is it fair that they charge this much, or should there be limits, and what should those limits be? But a more fundamental question, the one that really Satz is taking on, is are there goods that just shouldn't simply be in the marketplace to begin with? Are some goods so fundamentally important or so fundamentally different than other types of goods that we should not put them in a market setting? So while markets are good for many things, while the distribution that markets provide, while the productivity or efficiency that markets provide are good things, it's not always the case that just because something's efficient means that it ought to be in a market. So this is really the crux of Satz's argument, is that some things shouldn't be in the market, and the question is, well, how do we judge which of those things shouldn't be in markets? So this is what Satz wants to do in this chapter, sort of lay out generally, sketch a framework for evaluating whether or not things should be in a market-based or in a marketplace. Now, there's two aspects of what she calls noxious markets. So noxious markets are those markets that have are morally problematic in some way. And she says we can sort of break these down into two types of aspects of noxious markets. So she says the consequences of particular markets can make them noxious. Now, again, we should be clear that Satz isn't against markets in general. There are plenty of goods that it's completely appropriate to distribute via a market mechanism. But there are some things she thinks that don't pass a test, that for one reason or another ought not to be in markets. So one of the ways we can evaluate whether a good should be, or whether there should be a particular market in a good. So when she's talking about markets, we think markets in a good. So if we had markets in organs, in human organs, is that a good thing? Is that an acceptable practice? There are bioethicists who think that, in fact, we should have markets in organ donation. So you have 2 kidneys. If you can spare one, you should be allowed to put that on a market. So there would be a market in kidneys. Just like we have markets in DVD players, or markets in computers, or markets in food. So she's talking about particular markets, which means, are there some things in a particular market? Is there a market for? So that sort of language, or the way in which she's talking, is what she means by that. So consequences of particular markets, the result of putting something in a market, can have noxious effects. The sources of particular markets can also be noxious in one way or the other. So the way in which these markets come about, or the sort of internal structure of these markets, can also be bad. So it's not just the outcomes, but it's just the way in which the market itself is set up can be problematic from a moral perspective. So the consequences of particular markets. Satz is going to identify 2 consequences she thinks makes a market, or lends itself to making a market noxious. So one of those conditions is that when a market is extremely harmful to an individual. So there's some markets where it's possible that one could be left destitute, that is, without a home, without any possessions. And in such a case, what we'd say is there are unsatisfied basic interests. So agency interests and welfare interests. So when we're talking about agency interests, the agency interests are interests in being able to direct your own life. So when we go to the idea of a sort of liberal ethic, right, where every individual ought to have the right to decide how they want to live their life. They ought to have at least some basic means for doing that. And welfare, when we're talking about welfare, we should be clear that we're not talking about welfare in terms of welfare payments. It's not like going down and getting food stamps or housing subsidy. I mean by welfare, your basic interest in welfare is your basic interest in well-being, right? Do you have food, clothing, and shelter, and so forth? So it's not state. There's no implication here that the state is providing something. Unsatisfied basic interest means that some markets result in people that are destitute, which results in them unable to make choices on how to live their life, and leaves them extremely harmed in the sense that they lack a certain amount of welfare, the sort of welfare that most of us, I would guess, if you're taking a course in business ethics, you probably have a fairly good standard of living. In other words, being able to afford school means that you've probably got a place of residence, you probably have transportation to the university, or a computer to be listening to this online course. So general welfare interests are probably taken care of for most of us. But there are markets that will leave people in this sort of state. And so what Satz is saying is that when a market results in people being left destitute without these agency and welfare interests being taken care of, then that might be an indication that a market is noxious. Another way in which a market may be noxious is when that market is extremely harmful to society. Now, we should be clear that there can be some harms to individuals or some harms to society. So in any competitive market, some individuals may lose out. So what Satz is saying is that when we want to call a market noxious, is that those markets must be extremely harmful. There must be, now that requires a threshold, of course. What do we mean by extremely harmful as opposed to just harmful? If I compete with another company and my business goes under, that's going to harm me. In part, it might harm society a little bit if I employ a number of employees that I now have to let go. So there are harms in the market generally, but are those extreme harms? In other words, when my business goes under, can my people find work elsewhere? Can I start a new business and so forth? So keep in mind that as she's talking about these things, she's talking about sort of the worst case scenarios of this, when a market results in extreme harms to individuals and or to society. Now, a way in which a market can be harmful to society is by undermining equality. So there are markets that would result in people being less equal in our society. It would also undermine equal citizenship. So there's two types of equality. There's the equality, that sort of general equality between individuals, in which we all have a relatively good standard of living, we have the same basic opportunities, we have the same access to certain resources and things like that. There's that sort of social inequality. But then there's the equality of citizenship. And this plays out in, for instance, in things like campaigns, elections, being able to get adequate representation in courts. So if there are markets, and if these markets result in an unequal citizenship, then we might want to really look hard and decide whether or not those things ought to be subject to market forces. So undermining of equal citizenship, for instance, those with more money can buy more advertising. They can get their political perspective out over others. This is why there's a big debate now about campaign finance reform, right? So the Supreme Court hearing, the Supreme Court in the case of Citizens United, can groups or can corporations give any amount they want towards political campaigns? And the Supreme Court has upheld this. But there's real questions about whether this undermines equal citizenship. You and I as individuals don't have the resources that a corporation does, for example, to get our message out. And so we would, of course, now that's not a market in political ads. It's not a market in citizenship. But we would, of course, look really questionably at something like selling votes. So if there was a market in votes, the question is, would we allow that? Well, that would seem to undermine something like equal citizenship. Now, the sources of particular markets can also pose problems for or present challenges that would result in noxious markets. So what kind of sources are we talking about? Well, one way in which we might have a noxious market is one in which there's weak agency. Now, weak agency really refers to the individual and the individuals having a lack of knowledge regarding the consequences in the marketplace. So, for example, Satz talks in her book about a market in kidney transplants. And in some third world countries, this sort of market takes place. It's not necessarily sanctioned by the government, but sort of a black market in kidneys. Now, in many ways, the people who are willing to give a kidney tend to come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. They tend to be less educated, and they don't necessarily realize the health implications of giving one kidney. It's a serious procedure. It also has serious consequences after the surgery takes place for the non-recipient. For the donor, there's risk of infection. There's problem if the other kidney fails. There's those sorts of problems. There can be problems with diet. Any number of things can come up regarding kidney transplants. Now, if you as an agent aren't aware of all those consequences, then it seems that it's unfair that we have a market in kidneys if the vast majority of people who contribute to that market are those that lack knowledge regarding the consequences, that are uneducated or from lower socioeconomic classes, and then we take advantage of that. And so weak agency indicates that there might be something like a noxious market here. There's also the case of a lack of knowledge about the good being exchanged. So if you don't understand not only the consequences of the act, but what is being exchanged, how do you know what a fair price is? So when you have weak agency, you tend to have exploitation. People don't realize the value of the thing being exchanged. And again, we can point to things like kidney transplants or the selling of kidneys for transplantation, and say that a number of people say, well, what's a kidney worth? Well, it turns out that in some cases, people who will sell kidneys will sell them for $10,000 or $15,000, but only pay $2,000 or $3,000 to the donor in some of these third world countries. And so you say this weak agency means they're being treated unfairly. There's a great cost to donating an organ in which they're getting very low return, even though that return for them might seem astronomical. That might be 6 months or years worth of wages. But that doesn't mean there isn't exploitation. So the lack of knowledge about the good being exchanged, its true value, and so forth. A third aspect of weak agency can be the intermediaries of agents. So there are times when those who make decisions for others, so for example, parents making decisions for children, in such cases, we have to question whether the agents themselves, the intermediaries of the agents, I should say, are actually in a position to make an informed choice or a decision for the individual. So there are times when all of these factors can come into play. A lack of knowledge regarding the consequences of a particular market exchange, lack of knowledge about the good itself being exchanged and its value, and a lack of knowledge or a lack of concern by intermediaries on the part of agents. How do we know whether the intermediaries are in a position to make a competent choice? Another element is that of extreme vulnerability. So when we engage in market transactions, in an ideal world, the participants in a market transaction are on an equal playing field. So when I buy a car or go to the store and buy fruits or vegetables or so forth, I come with cash. There's the vegetable there for me to inspect. I can look and see whether it's good or not, and then I can make an exchange. But I don't have to buy from that particular store. I don't have to buy those vegetables there. But what happens in situations where I'm forced to buy, or when I have to participate in a market and I lack the resources or capacities to go elsewhere for the good that I'm looking for? So a lack of resources might mean that a market is noxious. So if I lack any income whatsoever, it might be that I'm willing to do any number of jobs just to survive. So a lack of resources can hinder or can result in my not getting a fair deal. It also means that it's a form of coercion in some ways. A lack of resources can result in coercing me into doing things that I would not otherwise do. So Satz in her book takes on the issue of prostitution, and should prostitution be legalized? Well, in part, it depends on the resources of the individual. If a woman or man, for that matter, is going into prostitution because of a severe lack of resources, then we might want to say that doesn't seem like a choice. It's not like every young girl dreams of growing up to be a prostitute. Well, why is that? Well, it seems that the only reason one does that, or at least in most cases, we can exclude, I would say I suppose there are some cases in which prostitution may be a choice that isn't motivated for financial reasons. But in a lot of cases, I think that's exactly what happens. And that seems to be Satz's view too. If you read in her book, she also takes on that the number of people who go into an industry like the selling sex services tend to come from desperate situations. And so lack of resources can creates a vulnerability, which results in a market that doesn't seem like it's a even playing field. Similarly, a lack of capacities may also force one into a market that isn't particularly good. So capacities in terms of there aren't other jobs that can be done. There isn't a social safety net for those, for example, who may be mentally slow in one regard or another, that mentally disabled or unable to work in normal industries or regular industries. Lack of capacities may result in one being extremely vulnerable. It's also the case that a lack of capacity could be viewed for even those of us who don't fall into a category of, say, the mentally incompetent or the mentally retarded, or however you want to say it, the mentally challenged. It might be that a lack of capacity is just in things like medicine. I don't have a degree in medicine. I don't have medical skills. That means that when I go to the doctor, I'm depending wholly on their skill set. So I don't have the capacity to judge. There's also cases where I simply don't have the ability to go somewhere else, so an emergency sort of situation. So capacities and resources can both lead to vulnerability, and vulnerability can lead to a noxious market in particular goods. So what exactly makes a market noxious? We've considered several of the elements, and all four of these taken together are what Satz uses to determine, or at least help determine, what sorts of markets are noxious. So if we sort of recreate the chart, this is again right from your reading, the source might be weak agency. We can look at a market and say, are the agents in there fully competent? We can look and ask whether the agents are vulnerable. Is it because a lack of capacities or resources forces them into a market that they would not otherwise voluntarily go into? We can also look at the outcomes. Is there extreme harm for individuals? Or is there an extreme harm for society? So all of these factors together, weak agency, vulnerability, harm to individuals, and harm to society, have to be taken together to determine whether or not a market is noxious. Or I should say, is or is not noxious. Now, one way of considering or looking at this issue is the notion of equal status in a democracy. And one of Satz's concerns is that when you have a noxious market, it tends to undermine society as a whole. In fact, it undermines our standing in a democratic society. So allowing some to control a large number of other people through these various markets leads to problems, broader social problems. So we know that for good citizenship, that there are certain goods that are required. So when you have markets that cause harm to individuals or cause harm to society, we know that this can result in problems with citizenship in general. So education, health, housing, and food are all prerequisites for being a good citizen. If I'm worried about getting my next meal, I'm probably not particularly concerned about whether I voted in a primary election or a general election or an issues election. If I don't have housing, I'm probably not participating in a political dialogue. I'm probably trying to survive. If I don't have health, good health, so whether this means free, affordable, socialized health insurance, however we sort of choose this, without a sort of minimum standard of health, I'm not going to be in a position to do much else in terms of citizenship, especially in cases where the health undermines my housing and my food. So going into bankruptcy or having such high medical bills that I can't afford housing or I can't afford food. And of course, for any notion of citizenship, understanding how our political process works, being able to communicate, being able to sort of debate is going to require education. And so markets that undermine those sort of fundamental goods are going to be problematic. So noxious markets for Satz are those that tend to do these sorts of things, that have these sorts of harmful consequences, both for the individual and society. And you can see there's a lot of overlap here, of course. That when we talk about harms to society, we are in many ways talking about harms to an aggregate of citizens. I, as an individual, when I lack housing, food, health, or education, makes me worse off, but that also leads to society being worse off when there's enough individuals like myself who lack these things. So Satz notes that there are certain exchanges that we right away, right off the bat, simply do not pass the tests that she's put forth that are harmful to individuals, that are harmful to society, that would undermine this sort of democratic citizenship that she's concerned with. So money for votes, which I've already mentioned, is an obvious example. That if we're looking for making people vulnerable, if we're looking for something that would leave people at the will of others, that would be harmful to sort of democratic citizenship in general, money for votes, definitely not something that we want to advocate, a market in votes. Military service. What's interesting is military service, for a long time, there were people who were able to buy their way out of military service. So it wasn't uncommon that there was markets in military service during the Civil War, for example. People would pay others to serve for them. But we think that military service is one of those sort of duties of citizenship. That if some people can buy their way out of military service, that this leaves others vulnerable, or the only people that would agree to serve, especially in a case when there's an ongoing conflict, would be those who were extremely vulnerable, who didn't realize the consequences of their actions, so forth and so on. So you can see how applying that sort of grid test would show that something like money for votes or military service probably wouldn't pass Satz test of a legitimate market, that these would be noxious. And finally, the same with judicial and legislative offices, that we don't think that money, that there should be a market in offices, that those who can buy their way into a judgeship or that can buy their way into a legislative office, the very democratic process that most of us, I assume, stand behind, is based on the idea that I get to pick those who are going to represent me. So at least from a legislative perspective, although a number of judicial positions are also elective, I get to look at a legislator and say, this is the type of person, or this is a person with a platform of principles that I endorse. And if, by the way, I don't like what they're doing, I have the ability to get them out of office in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, or depending on whatever the office happens to be. So we don't, I think, want to make it that just those who can afford to vote or who can afford to get office get to buy their way into office and can stay there as long as they want. So Satz is noting that these are exchanges that should be blocked outright, that it's obvious that these would result in noxious markets. Now, Satz says another problem with noxious markets deals with the idea of encouraging social interactions. When we have the existence of noxious markets, they tend to undermine those sort of positive social interactions we want to have in our society. So political co-deliberation is one of those types of social actions, right? We think that each individual ought to be able to be part of the political discussion. And markets which would undermine that ability are ones that we would consider noxious, and that they tend to undermine these sorts of social interactions. The development of civic capacities. When there are markets that result in harms to individuals, harms to society, these tend to also hinder the development of the ability to engage in civic activities, civic participation, political deliberation. So the development of civic capacities is something that we see as valuable. This is why, for example, when someone would say we want to undermine public education, well, the ability to act within the civic realm in any number of ways, whether it's political in nature, whether it's just issues or being part of a community, that requires a certain skill set. And it's not one that we think should be left up to just those who can afford to develop them. That this is important for society as a whole. And so we want to encourage social interactions. And there are markets that actually discourage social interactions. So we have the vulnerable or the weak are those individuals that suddenly are pushed outside of these sorts of valuable interactions we want to encourage. So as Satz says, some goods function as prerequisites for full inclusion in society, for counting as an equal member. A person who lacks a certain level of education or access to medical care or physical security is not only ill-equipped to navigate her own life and values, but also faces substantial impediments to participation in the economy and to participating in public debates about social choices. So there are things that are valuable, that are so fundamentally valuable that we shouldn't relegate those to market forces or allow them to be relegated or be determined by market forces. And these are the sorts of things that we need to protect. So again, let's emphasize here that Satz isn't against markets. She's against markets in things that result in an undermining of the sort of democratic life of our society. And she's also against those things that result in individuals being harmed in ways that keeps them out of the sort of broader political, social and political community. Now, what are the limits to Satz's approach? When you read Satz, especially at the beginning, you see that she seems to have these nice 4 ideas, these 4 main concepts, you call them principles, that seem to point the direction towards which markets are noxious, which markets aren't. But Satz herself recognizes that this is sort of, in some ways, a starting point for her theory. That she sort of sketched out the framework of her theory, she's put out the sort of 4 main concepts, but there's more work that needs to be done, and she herself acknowledges some of these problems. The first problem she notes, or shortcoming she notes, is the connection between noxiousness and legality. Once we determine a market is noxious, does that imply legally banning it? And she says, no, it doesn't imply legal banning. Now, why wouldn't we want to ban, legally speaking, a noxious market? Well, in one reason, and this is a reason that's common to morality in general, is that sometimes stopping a bad action, or in this case, banning a noxious market, may cause more harm than good. So sometimes we do have to make some sort of utilitarian calculation or rights trade-off. So for example, let's take the issue of drug use. There are those who say that marijuana should be legalized. Right now, drugs like marijuana are illegal. So we have a case now where somewhere someone has determined that a market in certain forms of drugs, certain types of drugs, is or constitutes a noxious market. Now, does that imply that it ought to be illegal, that this is the best course of action? Well, I think there's a case to be made that you could say that in a case like marijuana, or with a substance like marijuana, a market in marijuana could be viewed as a noxious market. On the other hand, you might say, well, does that mean it ought to be illegal? Well, how can we make sure that we get every lawbreaker in terms of marijuana? Well, it might be monitoring people at home. It might be putting cameras in houses. If we have enough suspects, maybe we should be bugging people's phone lines. And you might say, well, wait a minute, that seems extreme. That market might be noxious, that it might appeal to vulnerable, it might not be good for society and so forth. But is that really the best course of action? Because it seems to violate a number of other rights. I don't think we want our privacy invaded to that extent in order to get rid of that sort of market. So what are our other options? Well, as Satz notes, that sometimes the fact that a market is noxious doesn't mean that it requires a legal remedy, but we need to change the context. So some people argue, for example, that if we treated marijuana like alcohol, that there would be far less abuse, that it would be regulated, and that we could control the distribution of the substance. And through education, we could sort of teach people not to use marijuana, or that the bad effects of marijuana. So it's possible that just by changing the context, right now it's an illegal drug, it doesn't necessarily get a huge price, but it's definitely being paid more than it would be if it were on a market. And so sometimes a market, although noxious, perhaps to some, again, there's legitimate debate can go on in terms of drug use and recreational drug use and so forth. But just as an example, it might be that the case that legally banning it might not be the course to go or the way to go. Now, how do we know whether a noxious market should be made illegal or should remain legal, and that we should go try other means of dismantling or changing the context of that market? As Satz notes, that's a difficult question. And this is why noxiousness and legality becomes problematic, because which of those markets should we make illegal? Which should we allow but attempt to change in other ways? Another shortcoming or problem for Satz's approach is the idea of the conflict of parameters. Now, a conflict of parameters is just a conflict between which principles we value. So Satz notes there is legitimate disagreement about whether we ought to focus on increasing agency versus decreasing vulnerability. So sometimes there are trade-offs. In other words, we can have an issue in which we say, yes, that's true. It might leave people a little more vulnerable, but at the same time, it increases agency. And which way do we go? Do we favor agency or do we favor vulnerability? Do we favor autonomy versus decreasing harm? So there's a conflict between a harm principle and a liberty or autonomy principle. And Satz notes that the fact that we might emphasize one over the other is a source of legitimate debate. So there's a conflict of these parameters as possible. And so the question is, how do I sort of evaluate vulnerability versus agency, or social harm versus individual harm? So if it's a real social benefit, but there's some harm to individuals, is that acceptable? Can I make a sort of utilitarian calculation? And so this is problematic. And there's a number of times, if you read in Satz's book, a number of the issues that come up where you can see even yourself as you read it, or at least when I read some of the issues that Satz takes on in her book, where I was thinking to myself, well, what about the agency issue? Or what about the vulnerability? Doesn't your emphasis on agency here, or lack of emphasis on agency in this instance, mean that that you're overly worried about vulnerability? Are you saying that people are too vulnerable? You're not giving them enough credit, and that thus taking away some of their agency or their autonomy? Or doesn't this result in a lot less harm than you're granting? So this becomes problematic. And when you read Satz, you can ask yourself, can I evaluate all markets using these sort of 4 parameters that she gives without injecting sort of an additional debate? Don't I have to debate about a priority of these various ideas? Then there's a problem of operationalizing values, and this is sort of implied by the parameter view. Is there a price numerical interpretation of vulnerability before something becomes noxious? So at what point does someone become vulnerable? We're all vulnerable to one degree or another. The question is, when does that vulnerability become noxious? And Satz herself acknowledges that this becomes problematic. How do I attach a number, say, to vulnerability, or to agency or autonomy, or to harm? What's the tipping point for a social harm versus an individual harm? Or what's just the tipping point for an individual harm? All of us that engage in market transactions may suffer some individual harm. We may lose a job. We may have to relocate. We may have to take a pay cut. All of those things might be considered harms, but at what point does that harm constitute a noxious harm, one that now puts it on the level of this is now to be taken into consideration for banning that sort of market? There's also the proper problem of calculating the counter effects of laws and the distribution of resources on inequality. So what she means by this is that we can't always factor in how laws or other distributions in society may counter what is otherwise a noxious market. So we might have markets in, say, healthcare, but then we really have to calculate how something like Medicare or Medicaid counters the market effects. So it might be that a market left to itself would be noxious. But when we have laws and other distributions that are going on in society, it might be the case that that counters the noxious effect. And Satz acknowledges that we can't always, or at least she hasn't as yet, come up with a real good way of calculating the counter effects of these other distributions. And so this is problematic. So some might say, well, look, yes, everyone should have health care. But look, the majority of people can afford it, and those who can't afford it can get it, mainly seniors and the poor, can get it through the government this way. So we should allow healthcare to remain as a market sort of good. And of course, we have to come up with a calculus, right? There has to be some way of figuring out whether or not it is in fact true that this doesn't leave people vastly unequal or doesn't leave people extremely vulnerable. So Satz herself says that this is something that's a challenge to her theory, or at least what it requires is a further refinement of her theory. That's the problem of operationalizing values. Finally, another problem is that of changing circumstances. Is her theory, as she notes, sensitive to a change in the context in which a market takes place? So She openly acknowledges that some noxious markets may become non-noxious because of changing circumstances. So in a down economy, for example, what is otherwise a non-noxious market may become noxious. When there are a large number of people out of work, a large number of people with decreasing incomes, some markets may suddenly become, or leave those individuals may be left vulnerable to a market that in good times they would not be vulnerable to. And so she says there's a real challenge to these sorts of changing circumstances. Markets aren't static things. They don't always stay exactly the same. There are changes, as we noted, laws and other things coming into play, but also economic circumstances, changes in education, or access to resources. Any number of things may change a market from noxious to non-noxious and vice versa. So one of the things she notes is that there might be a problem here with the sensitivity changing circumstances in her theory. Finally, there's the question of, are there other accounts of noxious markets that better explain which ones should be not allowed, either morally or legally, and which ones should? And she says there's a real danger because sometimes it's an aesthetic question. So other accounts of noxious markets, and may say, is my objection to a market an aesthetic objection? That when it just doesn't sit right with me. It's a matter of taste, but it's not a matter of morality. Another one might be questionable intuition. So related to an aesthetic sort of judgment might be, well, my intuitions about this being one that leads to vulnerabilities, or this one that undermines a sort of citizenship, right? So it has a detrimental effect on our society. Are my intuitions good? And so if our theory about noxious markets rests on intuitions that are themselves questionable, this might draw into question her broader project. So I think if we look at Satz, I think she gives us minimally a valuable starting point. I think one, the very fact that she asked the question, are there some things that simply should not be for sale, is something we should all think about. Are there some goods, are there some things in our society that are so fundamentally important to us as individuals, to our society as a whole, that shouldn't be put under an efficiency blanket or under an efficiency umbrella, right? Just because we can distribute these things in a market or via a market approach doesn't mean we ought to. So does not imply ought, as we've said before, right? It's not just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. And I think Satz at least gives us a good starting point for thinking about which markets might be noxious. I don't think that these four ideas or these four concepts or principles she puts forth definitely settle the issue. But I think it's a good starting point for us to think about this. Does this market leave people vulnerable? Are the participants in this market fully informed? Can they make a good decision? Is there a high enough standard of agency? Do they have enough knowledge or information to be making these choices? Is this the kind of market we want to have in our society? Is this the kind of society we want to live in? So Satz is really asking some very fundamental questions about business practice. It's not to undermine all business. It's not to say that the market is, in some Marxian sense, unfair generally or exploitive generally. It's to say that there are certain particular markets that can, in fact, be exploitive, that can be bad for us in a number of ways. And the question is, how are we to justify banning those markets or attempting to change those markets or change the context in which those market transactions take place? How can we justify doing that? What will we appeal to? And this is where Satz, I think, is starting this sort of debate, giving us sort of a guiding or a starting point for thinking about these issues.